All right, for more on this story, we're joined now by Commission for Gender Equality Chairperson, Advocate Nthabiseng Sepanya Mogale. Advocate, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. The Gender Commission, along with the South African Human Rights Commission, of course, came out and said this particular DSD regulation is a gross human rights violation. We are learning now that the court found, in particular, that the applicant had not been afforded sufficient institutional and procedural safeguards in Switzerland to allow her to have her complaint examined effectively. What's your reaction?
We obviously are elated, as it has been pointed out by the Human Rights Commission. We were a second intervener, so this, to a large extent, is a victory very close to home. As the Gender Commission. But overall, it actually is an indication that what we had initially suggested, that this is outright discrimination, and it has got a tone of racism to it. Gender discrimination and has a tone of racism to it is actually correct.
So, the court says, especially since her complaints concerned substantiated and credible claims of discrimination. Do you think it's an indication of where the court is sitting, particularly on these regulations?
Yes, the court is correct in the sense that it is only after you have, unfortunately, two African women winning with very, very convincing victories in their different streams of athletics. This, and then you have a situation where now there are regulations that get introduced to say, no, you cannot participate anymore. You need to bring down your testosterone levels or you quit, because that is what the options were. You bring down or you quit. And that is where the court is actually saying that's not good enough. You cannot say to somebody, bring it down or quit. When you look at the impact of bringing down your testosterone levels in terms of your mental health, your physical health, your environment, your career, because for athletes, that is their career, versus you quit. It's almost like two very difficult choices, if a choice at all.
So what would you have expected, I suppose, the Switzerland court to have done in terms of allowing the athlete enough institutional and procedural safeguards in this matter to raise her complaint?
I think they were too rushed. They shouldn't even have gone to drawing up the regulations, but rather to undertake long-term research to find out what and how they could intervene, if they need to intervene at all. Why I say that is because the women who have been participating in these streams of athletics are actually born as they are. So that gives a very, very difficult twist to it. But even transgender women are women who deliberately and medically transfer from one gender to the other and go through a long a process to get to where they want to be. So it is not something that you just regulate on, take pen and paper and regulate on. So they should have been very circumspect in their approach before they get to regulation point to understand. But when you look at it, secondly, when you look at the context of human rights, there was no revisitation of some of the international human rights instruments that govern world athletics and a whole lot of other players in this instance, including member states.
So what do you make of the fact that World Athletics is still standing by these rules? I mean, that essentially means Caster has not been able to compete in the last 4 years. She is not yet going to be allowed to compete until, of course, these processes are still continuing. And this is happening at an international level, maybe even at the World Athletics level.
I think to some extent one would have expected that response, because sometimes, losing at a public stage like this is actually not a very kind experience. And the court's pronouncements were scathing. It's one thing to actually say we get where they're coming from, but it's another to actually say this was outright discrimination, because in essence that is what the court is saying. So that is a bit of a humiliating statement on public platforms. So their response was expected. So they may actually leave it afterwards, but I think it was an expected response for them to cover away nicely with a bit of perceived dignity from the public stage. But they could come back. But when they come back now, they may come back more ready, number one. But number two, I think the world must also now start being ready. Member states must start being ready now to fight this. South Africa, Namibia, and others need to lead the charge, so that we are able to actually rebut whatever the responses and the basis of their appeal that they will be bringing to the table, but also to amplify the context, the racial, the sexist, and everything else, this discriminatory context and tone that is laden with their appeal.
Yeah. So the court's saying there are no domestic remedies especially available to the applicant as far as they could see that could consider effectively this circumstance. You are now calling on the other various African states to join hands. What remedy are you going to be seeking, particularly to challenge the differences in sex development regulations?
When you look at the human rights, several UN instruments, it talks about gender equality, it talks about non-discrimination with regards to participation of people especially women and girls, in the sports of their choice, discouraging discrimination based on both gender, sex, and bodily built, as well as and inculcating to some extent through their instruments the respect for human dignity and bodily integrity of every participant. And all this goes against it. And that is why I say it now is left to the member states to actually say, we are not going to participate. We are going to fight this if there is an appeal, and it cannot be done in our name.
Again, this happening at an international level, at the world athletics level, what does this say about this platform and what we still need, I suppose, to learn in these structures?
Oh, it says a lot. It says a lot. It shows the inequalities that are inherent in these international entities and bodies. It shows the inequalities in terms of the status and stature of the individual member states in these bodies. It shows a whole lot of other power relations that are there, but it shows the hypocrisy of the West, particularly some of the European countries, your Switzerland, for example, but to some extent also not surprising, because Switzerland, contrary to popular belief, is very, very indifferent to African countries. It is indifferent to anybody outside of them. It is indifferent sometimes even to the UN itself. So it actually is an indication of some of the dynamics that are happening inside the UN and how it is taken by some of the member states.
It's regulation. One could maybe say it affects all competing within the female category of the sport. But do you believe that it is designed particularly to penalize and to affect black African athletes?
Absolutely, without a doubt. Those regulations were brought in 2018 by the IAAF after two of spectacular victories of Caster, and immediately they were applied to Christine, the Namibian athlete, Christine, and in 2021, again, after a spectacular victory. The selective nature, the selective application of these regulations in itself speaks volumes.
What would you say? What would be your appeal to the Switzerland government at this particular point? World Athletics says they must take this to the next step and put it to the European Human Rights Court Grand Chamber for a final and definitive decision. Do you think they should appeal?
No, obviously they shouldn't. But I would also say maybe this is the time for other UN structures to intervene, because this is not only an undermining of Caster or Christine's bodily integrity and violating them in terms of gender and race. It's about, overlooking what member states have agreed upon, of which some of the countries and Switzerland itself are a member. So this is the time when member states should actually now be standing up to be counted. But also we would like to hear the voice of the UN itself.
Advocate, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. Chairperson of the Commission for Gender Equality, Advocate Nthabiseng, Sepanya Mogale there. They would like to hear now the voice of the UN, but also member states are being rather vocal against this DSD regulation. This following, of course, the European Court of Human Rights ruling in favor of the applicant, that is Caster Semenya, saying that in particular the applicant had not been given and afforded sufficient institutional and procedural safeguards in Switzerland to allow her to have her complaint examined effectively, especially since her complaints concerned substantiated and credible claims of discrimination as a result of her increased testosterone level caused by differences of sex development. That's what the court ruled on that matter.